Transmitter device activated. Coordinates set for Earth 2.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Earth 2 podcast, your weekly exploration of the DC Comics multiverse and the legacy of their Golden Age characters through the Silver and the Bronze Ages of comics. I'm eight-legged Peter Watson.
And I'm David Steele. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us. You've got 8 legs. Hang on. 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's startling. It suits you.
It's what I do for,
You'd be able to get up and down the stairs
episodes
a bit more quickly with 8 legs. Anyway, listeners, hello, welcome back. Hot on the heels of our Tiger Man Portmanteau Legacy Anthology episode of a couple of weeks ago, we are back with another Legacy Portmanteau character episode this week. Now, in next week's episode, all being well, we will be doing the lead story from issue 169 of Superman Family, where Lois Lane and Superman encounter a character called the Tarantula.
Ooh.
And this has prompted us, this has actually been in the planning for a very, very long time, unlike the Tiger Man one, which was very spontaneous and very last minute. We are doing our DC Legacy episode on characters what were called Tarantula or something or not in it though.
Indeed.
The most famous Tarantula in DC Comics is, of course, the character of Jonathan Law. We'll get to him in a second.
Yes.
We are kicking off today with a story featuring the Golden Age Sandman, Wesley Dodds, heck yeah, star of the recent excellent 6-issue miniseries by Robert Venditti and Riley Rosmo. If you haven't read it already, listeners, get on it. It's excellent. Does exactly what you'd hope it would do, especially if you're a fan of Sandman Mystery Theatre. Yes, the Golden Age Sandman, Wesley Dodds. We're actually doing the first story of his to be published in Adventure Comics.
Hey.
His second published appearance overall, after obviously World's Fair Comics. But issue 40 of Adventure Comics published way back on the 15th of June 1939.
Gasp.
3 years and 3 days before the birth of Paul McCartney.
Wow, there you go.
So yes, Tarantulas, etc., Wesley Dodds, blah blah blah, Adventure Comics 40. Pete's going to tell you about the cover.
It's striking. It's very striking. Number 40, July 1939 at the top. Starting this issue, the daring exploits of the Sandman is above the Adventure Comics logo. 10 cents is what you had to pay for this comic. And the image on the front cover, it's the Wesley Dodds Sandman coming in a window. He's wearing a kind of brownie orange suit with a green tie, purple cape, green hat, his yellow gas mask. Actually, he's wearing spats.
So he is. How dapper.
Very stylish. And he's firing his gas gun as a man in a blue suit and his brown checked shirt who seems to be holding a whole wad of cash that he's dropping because he's being knocked out by Wesley's powerful gas.
Superb. Awesome. Does it actually relate to anything that takes place in the story? We'll have to wait and see.
Yes.
Peter and I are obviously reading from our copies of the Sandman Archives Volume 1. The story was also reprinted in issue 94 of Justice League of America if you want to read along at home. So we kick off with a nice establishing panel which shows the Sandman logo and tells us it's by Larry Dean, and we see the Sandman standing looking very peculiar. It's almost like he's doing an impression of Tommy Cooper with his hands sort of going just like that. Or
pull the string that Martin Landau did as Bela Lugosi in Ed Wood.
I haven't seen Ed Wood.
You've not?
No.
I'm very surprised. It's my favourite Tim Burton movie.
Interesting. No, I should have done, because about a year and a half ago, Brandon and Scott did a Tim Burton retrospective, and that did encourage me to pick up a couple of things I didn't have, but it didn't encourage me to get to Ed Wood, unfortunately. Oh well. Listeners, what's your favourite Tim Burton film? Write in and let us know.
Pee-wee's Big Adventure, a close second.
Big Fish is probably mine, surprisingly.
Okay.
Interesting. Anyway, right. A caption sets the scene.
The Sandman prowls again, and justice scores a blow to crime.
Panel 2, we see a newsboy hawking some papers, yelling,
"Extra! Vivian Dale kidnapped by Tarantula! Extra!"
And an older man, white hair, big blue hat, at least that's how he's coloured in the archive, the green coat, he approaches saying, "Paper, boy!" And we get a close-up of the headline. It's obviously the newspaper is clearly something like the World Telegraph or World Telegram. The Tarantula strikes. Actress held for $500,000. Gosh. Fulfilling his promise, the Tarantula struck at 10 tonight, spiriting wealthy Vivian Dale from her luxurious home despite heavy guard. Police baffled, and we see a shot of Vivian Dale, wide-eyed and terrified. And in panel 4, we see in the background, it's pretty cool, we see Wesley Dodds' butler Humphreys taking the older man's hat and coat out of the way. As the older man shows Wesley the headline of the newspaper, and he's saying, "Tell me, Wesley Dodds, how? How does a tarantula do it? The police had a 24-hour warning, and guards were swarming over our friend Vivian's estate. Wesley, with his pipe in his mouth, looks thoughtful and says,
The tarantula has ability.
Ability? He's got magic. How else could anyone smuggle Vivian out? I ask you.
Maybe he didn't smuggle her out, Tom. Vivian's big house is old. Very old.
Stop talking riddles, Wesley. I want to do something. I want to help. If only we had a master sleuth, Philo Vance, the Sandman. There's a brilliant mind. He solved scores of cases for the police, but he's a mystery. Nobody knows who he is or where he is or anything. If he knew, maybe he could save Vivian. Wesley looks thoughtful again and says,
Maybe he does know.
Bosh. This affair's upset us, so we're dreaming. Better get some sleep. Think clearly tomorrow. Good night, Wesley. A very Mark Twain look to this Tom fellow with his moustache and his black bow tie and long white hair, etc. First panel of page 2, and Humphreys is seeing Tom out, and as he goes, Wesley quietly says,
Good night, Tom.
And then we get a couple of panels where Wesley looks thoughtful and sits down and smokes in his pipe and looks thoughtful, and then we see him making his way up the stairs, and he says,
Good night, Humphreys.
Good night, sir, says Wesley's long-suffering butler by way of reply. Next panel's great. We see Wesley picking up a little doll figure of a man, has a little hat, and then in the next panel he set this little doll down on his bed, so he sat up against his pillow, and Wesley waves towards the little doll, saying,
Good night, Mr. Wesley Dodds. Sleep tight. Extinguishing the lights, Wesley presses a concealed button. A wall panel silently opens.
Moving into the dark space.
A few minutes later, in a secret underground laboratory, Wesley prepares some chemicals for a strange gun.
Yes, great shot of Wesley in his lab with his gas mask on, wearing a white sort of overcoat, lab coat effort, and we can see test tubes and Bunsen burners and jars and things all going on as he mixes up some sleeping gas. Fantastic.
Then he dons all black apparel.
Except he doesn't really. He's wearing an orange suit, a green hat, and a purple cape and yellow gloves. What can you do? But he has a gas mask on, which means we can see who he is, and very proudly, this figure now declares,
There, Mr. Sandman is ready.
Interesting. Caption for panel 2.
1 hour later, having slipped through the surrounding police web, the Sandman skillfully enters Vivian Dale's home.
It's very effective as we see him in silhouette entering through the French windows, as it were, and he hides behind a big curtain and sees a discussion going on. We can see some police officers, a couple of people in plain clothes, and obviously some civilians all sort of standing around, and the lead cop is saying, You're all suspects. All of you, house guests and employees alike, were here when Miss Dale disappeared, so you're all possible accomplices of Tarantula. We'll have to hold you here tonight. One older man wearing a red dressing gown steps forward and says, See here, Captain, I won't stand for this treatment. But he's interrupted by the captain who's wearing a green suit and a brown hat, and he says, Sorry, Mr. Crossart, but you'll have to. Now, everybody, go back to your rooms, lock the doors, and stay there. Addressing the group, he continues the next panel, We're expecting a visit, a message from the Tarantula. We don't want anyone prowling about when he comes. And one of the maids looks a bit shifty, and she says, Don't worry. We then cut back to the Sandman standing outside, moved out after listening, and he says to himself,
So, the tarantula comes again tonight. Good. Meanwhile, I'll look around.
Final panel, page 3. And we see the Sandman is scaling the side of the building, climbing onto the ivy. Caption for the first panel on page 4.
Carefully investigating Vivian's room, the Sandman taps the walls lightly, here and there.
Yep. I guess that must have been Vivian's room that he was approaching in the final panel of the previous page. Yes, we see him examining, shining a torch around, and he says, to himself.
Suddenly he snaps off his light, remains motionless.
Yes, because we can see it in the corner. It looks like behind Vivian's full-length dressing mirror, another kind of doorway has opened, and a figure wearing a long blue cape and a sort of blue hood makes his way into the room, crosses and then opens another door. Sandman thinks to himself,
The tarantula, delivering his message.
Caption for the next panel.
Feeling about the huge mirror, the Sandman finds a catch, presses it.
Yep, and we can see doorway opening up. The Sandman thinks to himself,
My chance to find Vivian. Shadow-like, he steals through the tortuous passageways.
Yes, we see him making his way down. We can see a shadow cast in front of him, not his own. And we see this shadow is being cast by a man in a suit and a hat who's sat down keeping guard over a young woman in a red dress who's got her hands tied behind her back, down on the floor. Sandman clocks her and thinks,
Vivian. The Sandman slowly presses one of the triggers of his strange gun, A sweet-smelling gas emanates and fills the room.
Yep, great shot of the gun in action. We see the gas drifting in front of the man who's keeping an eye on Vivian, and the man rubs his head and says, "I smell flowers. Violets? Guess this place is getting on. Gee, I'm falling asleep." And in the next panel we see that he's down on the ground, out like a light. Sandman walks over and says,
The sands of deep sleep fill his eyes, and Vivian's too. Now to deal with the tarantula himself.
yeah, we can see that Vivian is sat up and obviously she's been affected by the gas. The caption for panel 2 then reads,
Exploring the branching tunnels, the Sandman peers into various rooms of the old house.
yeah, we can see that he's opened a sort of like little hatch in the wall that's hidden behind a light fitting. We can see his goggled gaze peering through, and we see that he's watching a couple of policemen having a conversation, a couple of uniformed cops. The first one is saying,
Captain, he's been here. The tarantula knocked out Sergeant Kelly and left this note pinned next to his badge.
"What?" exclaims the other officer. And in the next panel, we see the Sandman emerging from the door to another secret passageway in another room, and he says out loud,
An empty guest room. Mr. Crossart's cane.
yes, and we see Mr. Crossart's cane and his red dressing gown draped over a chair. Very interesting.
Meanwhile, back where Vivian is tied,
Yes, and we're with the tarantula, who has found the guard who was keeping an eye on Vivian asleep on the ground, and Vivian also out against the wall where she's leaning. The tarantula proclaims, "You're asleep? That violet odour, this sprinkled sand. The Sandman's been here."
with automatic ready, the tarantula stalks through the passageways.
Yep, see the tarantula moving along with his gun in front of him, saying, "He'll regret having interfered."
Peering into Crossart's room, the tarantula sees a shadowy figure bent over a desk.
Yeah, it's all very gloomy and moody. In the foreground, we still see the dressing gown and the cane that belonged to Crossart, but we see what appears to be the Sandman sat at the desk. We can see his cape and his hat. It looks so as if he's reading something. Caption the final panel of page 5.
Silently opening a secret door, he aims his gun and fires.
Yes, and there's a great shot of the tarantula firing his pistol. First panel of page 6, the tarantula moves into the room, starts to put his gun away, and he says, "Nobody heard. My silencer works well." But what he hasn't seen is standing behind him, minus his hat and cape, it's the Sandman who fires his gas gun. In panel 2, we see Tarantula putting his hand up to his throat as the gas surrounds his head and he falls down. Sandman kneels down beside him in the next panel, removing the hood, revealing a familiar face. And Sandman says,
So simple to fool you, Mr. Tarantula, alias Mr. Crossart. My hat and cape on a pillow, a string to topple it when you shot.
The next panel we see Wes putting back on his hat and cape as he says,
Now I must hurry. I have arrangements to make.
and there's a slow dissolve.
Next morning,
Old Tom is back, hassling Wesley as Wesley's having his breakfast. We see Humphreys coming in with a tray with something on it, and Tom, newspaper in his pocket, is saying, "Can you believe it, Wesley? It's just as if the Sandman had heard me pleading for help. Look here," holds up the newspaper. "It says this morning the police found Vivian unharmed fast asleep in her room. Tied to the foot of her bed was the tarantula and another thug, both asleep. There was sand sprinkled lightly over them all, the Sandman's signature. By George, it's unbelievable. It's amazing. It's... For heaven's sake, Wesley, say something." And Wesley, wide-eyed and a bit sleepy, looks up from his breakfast and says,
remarkable, Tom. Remarkable.
and a large caption tells us we have reached.
The end.
Well, that was fun.
That was great fun, yeah.
I tell you, I've said this in the past, I'm sure, but there's a particular quality to Golden Age Wesley Dodds stories that, you know, even modern stories featuring him still kind of I've managed to keep a hold of. Just that gloomy, sort of claustrophobic, sort of
Yeah,
dark sort of sense.
in the dark, in the shadows. It's very Batman-esque as well, without the caped crime fight. Well, it's still caped.
I was going to say there's one interesting caption.
Mm-hmm.
If we go to page 4, a caption reads, "Shadow-like, he steals through the torturous passageways."
Yes.
So does that mean he's like a shadow or like the shadow?
Bit of column A, bit of column B.
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I must point out, get this part out of the way, the Tarantula is the name of the opening story arc in the 90s Sandman Mystery Theatre series. First 4 issues of that series deal with that story, and I reread it in preparation just so to check if there was any kind of similarity.
Sure.
There isn't really.
Okay.
I was wondering if there maybe be character names that were sort of reused, but it's not. It does involve a young woman being kidnapped.
Okay.
And the Sandman Mystery Theater story features a number of young women being sort of kidnapped and horrible things being done to them, but it's not done by Mr. Crossart, and it doesn't involve an actress called Vivian being held for $500,000.
Back then?
That's
wow.
a fortune. That's ridiculous levels of money. She must have been box office gold.
Definitely, yes.
So obviously, listeners, I will post the relevant Sandman Mystery Theatre Tarantula covers on the socials this week to pad things out.
Yeah.
But it's worth mentioning that the SMT kind of, on occasion, would take the absolute bare bones of a Golden Age story and use it as the base for for one of their stories. But this is quite interesting. Wesley's just super chill in this, isn't he?
He is. It's the meeting with him and Tom. It's very much like the very first Batman story where Commissioner Gordon's round at Bruce Wayne's house and they're just chatting about the current crimes that are happening, and Bruce is all very blasé about it. It's pretty much it's almost like a cut and paste from those. So to be honest,
yeah, that's funny.
But yeah, it's the same idea. But it's great fun. But you're right about Tom's Mark Twainish appearance. It does look like William Hartnell's throwing a kind of handlebar moustache.
Yes,
in some panels.
Yeah, I mean, I do like. Tom's obviously the one that makes Wesley aware of this, but I mean, I just love the really understated Goodnight Humphreys. Humphreys obviously is a character that was used in Sandman Mystery Theatre, but Wesley saying goodnight to the little doll version of himself, that's something that appears in Sandman Mystery Theatre.
Oh, right, okay.
I might post a couple of comparison panels side by side from that, listener, so we can all have a look at it.
I've not really read Sandman Mystery Theatre since it was out, to be honest. And there's some bits I've not even read yet because I've basically picked them up as back issues. And
Really? Oh my goodness.
So I've not read the whole thing altogether.
Right. It was cancelled in 1999 and I, at that point, was a few years behind with it. What I would do with that, I would pick it up and every so often I would read a story arc or a couple of story arcs because it was one of those things, it was so good. It was, it was good to sort of savour it. And then when it was cancelled, I still had a couple of years worth to read. So I spaced them out over a good few years and don't think I actually finished it until 2007.
Oh, really?
Wow. Before I read the end. I just, I kept... I didn't want it to end, so I just kept hold of them. But I think round about 2015, 2016, I reread the whole thing, and it is marvellous. It's for me, it's up there with Starman as one of my absolute favourite series of all time. It's just
good, cool.
Matt Wagner and Guy Davis and Steven Seagal, just like it's phenomenal. And obviously they bring in characters like the Crimson Avenger and Hourman and Black Hawk and the Mist and all this throughout. But it's sort of, it just works so well because the character stuff is so good. And I'm sure I've raved about it elsewhere. I probably... Ross and I have talked about SMT on Stop This Team Up in the past, part of Opal City Confidential. If you want to hear Ross and I talking about that, go and find the relevant episodes of that series. It's nice how, like, the Sandman actually has more lines than Wesley, but he says them all to himself rather than to anyone else.
Yeah, he doesn't really have interaction with anyone, really.
And I like the bit at the end where everything that happens off camera and then Tom comes in and tells Wesley what he's read about it in the paper. I think that's quite subtle, quite a clever bit of storytelling. I would have liked maybe a larger confrontation between Wesley and the Tarantula.
Yeah, but it's kind of like how the Sandman works. So he literally sneaks about, he fires his gas gun twice and everything's resolved. And it's detective work, it is sneaking about, investigating things, but he's not hugely confrontational as such. No,
but it would have been nice just to kind of say, because obviously we were told that Mr. Crossart is obviously one of the house guests. He obviously was aware of the layout of the building and thought there was an opportunity. It would have been nice maybe just to get a little bit more of his his motivation or what he was up to, sort of thing.
Well, in 6 pages, there's only so much you can do.
This is true. This is true.
And bear in mind, 6 pages, and he was the cover feature of Adventure Comics. So, they felt this is strong enough to make him why people are buying the comic.
And his debut appearance in the comics getting the cover. But, I mean, they could have quite easily lost a couple of panels of Wesley sneaking and just maybe given another bit of dialogue to... a confrontation between him, but obviously he's taken Tarantula by surprise, which is the main thing. But it's interesting.
Some of the best panels were Wesley sneaking about the place because it's very atmospheric.
Artwork's beautiful.
Good. Yeah, even in the reproduction, a lot of people complain about the archives and how artwork's been changed and touched up and recolored. There's only so much you can do with these historical books.
Exactly.
Damage has been done to them over the years, and
I'm sure there's probably higher quality scans of some available into others, and of course they've got to make them presentable. They couldn't. And I think it was at the Volume 2 of the Starman archives. They didn't do as much restoration. It was really just they just printed the scans, and it wasn't quite as. It was okay, but it didn't look quite as good as the ones that have been kind of, as you say, kind of touched up and recolored. I think it's one of these things. It's compromise, isn't it? And I think what the archives did was probably for the best.
I know some of the Golden Age Marvel collections have been majorly touched up. There's some side-by-side comparisons of a Namor the Submariner story, and it's really, really, really different.
Right.
But yeah, it's hard to comment on that here, but it seems authentic. As you read it, nothing's really taken us out of the story, so
No.
I think the reproduction's probably quite close to the original. So
Faithful to what was intended, I suppose. And the artwork's gorgeous, it really is. Reading it, it doesn't feel like you're reading something that's, 80 odd years old. In a lot of ways, it feels very similar to the modern. I say modern, I'm talking about some stuff that's published 30 years ago now.
Yeah.
But the modern Wesley Dodd stuff, it's very satisfying to a fan, to a modern fan of the character, I think.
And of course, fun fact about this story is it's the story right before the story we've already done, featuring the evil version of Wing.
That's right.
That we covered in a Road to the Seven Soldiers of Victory.
Yeah, like a year ago.
Yeah.
It's a year since the Seven Soldiers stuff. We're recording this on July the 11th, listeners. It's a year since we started releasing our Seven Soldiers episodes. How terrifying is that?
Oh, yes.
Good grief. Will the Seven Soldiers be back? I hear you cry. Yeah, you know
Stay tuned.
You know that. Right, so that deals with our first tarantula.
It does indeed. Let's scurry off onto our second.
And our second tarantula story that we're going to do today is from issue 10 of Star Spangled Comics, published on the 1st of May, 1942. The 1st of May, when I was tall and Christmas trees were small. And this one features the DC Comics hero, the Tarantula. Peter, when did you first encounter the DC Comics hero, the Tarantula?
In the pages of All-Star Squadron. I couldn't tell you the issue. Maybe... No, I couldn't tell you the issue.
you know the one when Thor's sort of coming in the ceiling? And that was the first one that I met him in. And that was that would have been about early 86, because I had a friend who lived around the corner from me who moved away summer of 86. And at this point I was getting, quite deep into my first period as a sort of dedicated comic collector, very much a Marvelite at that point, picking up the occasional DC comic if Captain Marvel, Shazam was involved or whatever. And this kid David, who lived around the corner, he had found an issue of All-Star Squadron in basically a cupboard.
Oh, there you go.
In his building, in his clothes, and it was that one with Thor on the cover. So that was the first time I met Liberty Bell and Tarantula and Johnny Quick, and I was like, "Who the heck are these guys?" The comic wasn't the best, and it didn't stay with me for very long. It was not like I held on to it, but that kind of stuck in my head. As like, "Who are these guys? Who are these guys that have the All-Star Squadron? What?
Yeah.
What?" Not knowing that in nearly 40 years I'd be counting down to getting ripped into those issues on a podcast I was doing with my pal Pete.
Yes.
So yeah, the Tarantula. Pete, do you want to give everyone some facts about the Tarantula, aka Jonathan Law?
Yep, the hero known as the Tarantula first appeared in Star Spangled Comics number 1, came out in October 1941, and was a regular feature in Star Spangled up until its 19th issue. Then he vanished completely.
Gosh,
yes.
That's kind of ridiculous in a way, because he becomes quite prominent in All-Star Squadron, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. Yeah, definitely. But I suppose that gave Roy more freedom to do different stuff with the character.
Absolutely.
So
yeah, I mean, he's the definition of a blank slate, really. Because they give him that new costume, and it's just, essentially a new character. Anyway.
He was a mystery writer known as John Law then. He became Jonathan Law, obviously, when Roy took over and decided to give him a longer name.
Just to pad out his word count.
Indeed, yes. He developed suction cups so that he could actually climb up buildings and adhere to walls and stuff like that. And also a web gun, which is quite funny because tarantulas don't actually spin webs.
Interesting.
Yes. In his first appearance, he was referred to as both Tarantula and Spider-Man.
Yes. Is it not like retconned in All-Star Squadron, which we'll get to eventually, like it was a radio broadcast or something refers to him as Spider-Man, which is very funny.
Yeah, hilarious. But obviously he went with the Tarantula name. Now, funnily enough, he did have a bit of a recurring rogues gallery. The first bad guy was a hood called Ace Juice.
Right.
But then he had several costumed characters and other supervillainy type characters that he came across. There's the Crime Candle, there's Sting and Bandana Barden.
Wow.
They had multiple appearances. They actually teamed up as the Trio of Terror.
Wow.
There was the Blade. There were the characters we're going to talk about today. There was a character called Steeplejack Stall. There was the Fly, which is quite appropriate for the spider to go up against the fly.
Yes.
We may come back to the fly at some point.
Yeah, because we've done an episode on wasps, haven't we?
We have. And we're doing tarantulas.
We've done tarantulas. So we'll probably have to do flies or ants or something before too long.
Yes.
Anyway.
And of course, as featured in All-Star Squadron, he had kind of a housemaid called Olga, who was comedy gold.
Yeah, Olga. I seem to remember Olga popping up in All-Star Squadron quite often.
Mm-hmm, she did.
Quite regularly. More often than, say, Wildcat or Mr. Terrific. Not that I'm bitter about such things.
Post-crisis, obviously, he was an old man and retired in the current stage, and he appeared in Nightwing.
That's right, yes.
And inspired Catalina Flores to become a legacy character,
Yeah.
Tarantula.
Yeah.
And there's some quite controversial storylines involved with
Yes,
her.
yes, which we won't go into details here, but just let's just say that Devin Grayson had sort of like a little bit to talk about.
Yes.
At one point after it sort of...
I really like Devin Grayson's writing, actually. I think it's a really good run, yeah.
The Nightwing stuff's terrific. We're gonna, obviously, listeners will post a few relevant Catalina Flores covers in the socials this week, just so that, you can get a look at her as a legacy character, because, as she's post-crisis, we won't really be talking about her. But yeah, I'm sure she popped up against Green Arrow a couple of times in the New 52 era as well, so I'm going to do some digging.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember in the Golden Age series with James Robinson, when they sort of introduced the idea that Johnny Chambers and Libby Lawrence split up and she'd gone with Jonathan Law instead?
Yeah.
And I remember reading that and thinking, wow, that's just like... And it's weird to think, like, the Golden Age at the time, because I was like 20 when the Golden Age came out, and it felt like a million years since All-Star Squadron, but Young All-Stars had only finished like 4 years previously to that time. It was like the gap between the end of All-Star Squadron and the Golden Age is nothing compared to how long you think it was when the JSA were off the table after the New 52 debacle sort of kicked in. It's because, we've had stories recently that picked up on stuff that Jeff Johns was seeing like 20 years ago. It's crazy and longer in some cases. Anyway, to get back to the point, with 19 Golden Age appearances of John Law, the Tarantula, to choose from, Peter has selected, as we say, this one from issue 10, and without further ado, we shall get stuck in. We have an opening splash image, a large tarantula along the top, and we see a tarantula in his costume, which we haven't really mentioned at this point, is very similar to the Golden Age Sandman. After, he was revamped. It's yellow with a purple hood and shorts and gloves, and he still has a purple cape at this point, and he's firing his web gun towards a few very unsavoury looking people. There's a kind of angry-looking bald man in a kind of orangey-brown suit who's been wrapped up in the line. And there's another not quite so angry bald man in a brown suit who's been coiled up. There's a guy slightly oddly shaped.
Penguin-esque almost.
Yeah. Looks as if he could have been played by Ronnie Corbett or Tony Hancock, with thick glasses and what's left of his hair sticking up almost in devil horns at the side. He's waving a stick at them all. And hovering above them is a young lady dressed in blue who appears to have yellow butterfly or moth-type wings flying overhead. A caption further sets the scene.
Plain John Law, the mystery writer, lives his wildest imaginings as once again he becomes Tarantula, whose web gun spins silken strands to trip, tangle, and to bind the masters of evil and crime. Like his deadly namesake, now he crouches, now he speeds, now he strikes, now he weaves his snare in the adventure of... Four on a Web.
And we're told this has been brought to us
by Hal Sharp.
Right, and we then have a further caption that sets the scene for the first panel of the story.
An infamous ex-convict walks the city streets.
Yes, it's the aforementioned chap with the thick glasses and, as Peter said, the almost penguin-type torso. He's walking away, and a policeman, uniformed cop, and another chap are watching him. The uniformed cop says,
"Yeah, that's Bugsy Bonner. Sort of cracked, but harmless. He just finished a stretch in the big house."
The next panel, we see Bugsy descending a little flight of stairs to open a low-level doorway that's off the street. You can see a nice fence sort of grating sort of surrounding it all. And he looks back, obviously aware of the policeman, the other chap, and he's saying, almost to the camera, "Those scoffers think they insult me by calling me Bugsy. Don't they know that insects will someday rule the world?"
In Bugsy's basement den, 3 visitors await him.
Yes, we see, as we described earlier on, Bugsy looking at a slightly pointy-nosed young man, bald chap in a brown suit, a very Eastern European, mysterious-looking lady dressed in blue with nice red sort of butterfly moth-type fastenings on her jacket. She's smoking a cigarette. And the very angry-looking, big-nosed, baldy, heavy-eyebrow chap who looks a bit like me, it must be said in this panel. He's also standing there. Bugsy addresses these 3 people and says, "I see 3 of those I sent for, but where is the 4th?" And the angry-looking chap with the big nose taps his big nose and says,
"What 4th, Bugsy? I came when you wrote me, you remember? I'm Scorpion Sykes."
And the younger chap in brown says,
"And I'm Cricket Crowd."
And the lady in blue says, "You won't have forgotten me, Miss Moth." To which Bugsy says, "I also tried to locate that guy who calls himself Tarantula. I advertised for him in the personal column. Told him it would be to his advantage to meet me here." Scorpion Sykes pipes up with,
"Tarantula bobbed up since you could send away, Bugsy. He's no outlaw. He fights for the law.
Bah! Any man who wears a mask is an outlaw. In any case, he seems to have stayed away.
But swinging in on a strand from his web gun enters Tarantula.
Yeah, coming in through the window is Tarantula. The others whirl and look at him. And as he arrives, Tarantula says,
No, I haven't. I'm here.
they're all sat down at a table in the next panel. Tarantula says,
Anybody who sends for me generally gets action, because action is what I thrive on.
Sykes says,
Be careful of this guy, Bugsy. He's dynamite.
and Bugsy raps his walking cane on the table, saying, So am I. Now the meeting will come to order. In prison, I had the opportunity to study insect ways. Science thinks that insects can and will overcome human civilization. That means that insect personalities will succeed in the world of crime,
Let me interrupt. You've brought us together for criminal purposes?
says Tarantula. Exactly, I've...
Stop right there. I've heard enough to convince me that you all belong in jail, or in a fly trap.
Cricket Code stands up at this point and says,
I expected this.
and he lashes out in the next panel with a high kick as Bugsy says, That's right, Cricket, deal with him. Cricket says,
You know what it feels like to be kicked by a cricket?
to which Tarantula says,
No, and I don't intend to find out, but you might be interested in taking a tarantula turnover.
and with that, Tarantula brings up his left hand and says, Cricket Code flying. Miss Moth exclaims, Oh, help! As Scorpion Sykes steps forward saying,
Getting roughshod, huh? I've got something here that'll smooth you down.
but Tarantula fires his web gun at Scorpion Sykes, wrapping up on the line, saying,
Then you'd better keep it right where it is. This little loop of silk will help you.
With Cricket down the ground and Scorpion Sykes all tied up in the next panel, Tarantula takes a step back from the others as Bugsy says, Why be so violent, Tarantula? We've not done any crimes yet, only discussed them. We can't be punished until we're guilty.
Quite right. But I'll be watching you from now on, and the first move you make will wind up very tangled indeed.
Tarantula has taken his leave, prompting a Cricket to say,
He's gone.
and this prompts Sykes to say,
This is your own fault, Bugsy. We told you Tarantula was in the sight of the cops. If I could have drawn my stinger...
Since you didn't, it remains a trump card, and I had my reasons for what I did. Bugsy gets a nice close-up in the next panel, really sort of, he's a real touch of Owlman to him, doesn't he?
Yes, absolutely.
As he continues, Police always try to fix the evidence concerning a crime. If Tarantula should be nosing round, maybe we can fix the evidence first. Tarantula is very picturesque, and a picture should be framed. We'll frame him.
The next evening, at the home of quiet John Law, mystery writer...
Yeah, John seems... Is he sat up in bed or is he just sat in a chair? I don't know, but he looks very comfortable. His housemaid Olga enters the room. John says,
What is it, Olga?
A lady to see you, Mr. Law.
Enter Miss Moth.
Yep, you see Miss Moth in a blue hat and blue outfit, etc. And John smiles and says,
How do you do? What can I do for you?
You're John Law, the writer. People say that Tarantula has been seen, coming and going around your home. I wonder if you can take me to him.
I'm afraid I can't do that. You see, I met him only once or twice, when he gave me some information for my books.
Then I must look elsewhere. I'm so disappointed.
But as Miss Moth leaves, John Law hurries into a strange costume.
Yep, and it's Tarantula who we see, sticking his head out the window to watch Miss Moth take her leave, and he says,
There she is, going down the street. I'm curious to know what she has to say.
Firing a line, he swings down to land in front of her. Miss Moth proclaims, Tarantula, I came here looking for you.
Yes, I overheard your conversation with that fool John Law. And why, may I ask, are you looking for Tarantula?
It's that horrible Bugsy Bonner. His gang intends to ambush the Union Mills payroll cart tonight. But I want nothing to do with the plan. I'm trying to go straight, like you.
Oh, I'm straight, Miss Moth. I never went crooked to begin with. But how can I be sure this isn't a trap?
Suddenly, in the next panel, Cricket Cody appears and fires a gun in the direction of Tarantula and Miss Moth. Miss Moth, you can see the seams in her stockings here, listeners. She's a bit of a femme fatale. Reaches forward to hug Tarantula in fright as she says, Help! They learned I was going to warn you. They're after me. This prompts the Cricket to say,
Moths shouldn't turn into rats, sister.
Miss Moth, hiding behind Jonathan now, as Tarantula turns to face the Cricket, she says, Save me! Get me out of here! And at this point, Tarantula, I'm miming it for the benefit of our YouTube viewers, fires another web line into the ground in front of the Cricket who's moving towards them. As this happens, Tarantula says,
There, Cricket, trip over that.
and then in the next panel, John fires another web line which tangles the Cricket up completely. Tarantula saying,
I hadn't anything on you before, but this time you'll be turned over to the police for assault with a deadly weapon.
This prompts Miss Moth to look to her left and she says, No time for that. Here comes some more. And we hear a bang from off camera. Good grief.
Attacked from other points, Tarantula dares not risk the life of the girl. he retreats.
Yes, with bullets zinging behind them, presumably being fired by Scorpion Sykes and some other folks. Tarantula fires another line and bears him and Miss Moth up onto the roof of a nearby building. Miss Moth says in the process, "Thanks for saving me, Tarantula. Don't forget what I told you about the payroll robbery."
I'll take care of it, Miss Moth. You're safe here. Goodbye.
Tarantula then takes his leave.
But as soon as Miss Moth is left alone, she makes a telephone call.
Brilliant artwork here, actually. We see two little insert panels of Miss Moth on the phone to Bugsy, and she is saying, "I fluttered around his flame very successfully, Bugsy, and Cricket and Scorpion made a most realistic attack. He swallowed the story. Splendid. You'll play another very important part in fixing the blame on Tarantula when he shows up."
Believing Miss Moth's tale, Tarantula approaches the spot she described.
We see Tarantula climbing up a tree, looking down, and we can see a sign that says "Road Closed" and a vehicle approaching it, picking out the sign with its headlights. Tarantula, looking at all this, says,
They've got the road blocked. That car slowing down must be carrying the payroll.
In the next panel, we see Scorpion Sykes and Cricket Cody pulling guns on the people inside the car, with the Cricket saying,
Hands up in there. Better not give us any argument.
At this point, Tarantula swings down from his tree, saying,
Speak for yourself, Cricket. I'm taking a little part in your show.
Once again, he fires another web line that surrounds Cricket and ties him up.
There, Cricket. I've put a crick in you, and I'll likewise score on Scorpion.
And with that, with his left hand, he punches out Scorpion Sykes, who goes, ooh, and falls backwards, and Tarantula continues,
Where's your boss, Bugsy?
Tarantula crosses to the car, the payroll car, etc., leans in towards them, saying,
It's all right, you in there. These birds aren't grabbing any payroll tonight.
But from inside the car, a familiar voice says, Are you quite sure, Mr. Tarantula? And we see in the next panel, Miss Moth was driving the car. She leans out and cautious Tarantula, knocking him out, saying, I hate to do this to a really nice gentleman, but business comes first with our little organisation. Next panel, we see Tarantula lying flat out on the ground, with Bugsy and Cricket and Scorpion all standing around him. Scorpion, with his head still spinning from the punch, says,
If I'd only had a chance to use my special weapon in that mug.
Bugsy says, Stop grumbling, Scorpion. Back in the bushes and slip on that costume. Cricket, when you're loose, drag Tarantula out of sight.
Moments later...
Our Jonathan's obviously down on the ground, because the Cricket is bouncing up and down and laughing and saying,
How nice and quiet he lies.
And we see that Scorpion Sykes has put on Tarantula's uniform, saying,
I still think I'd like to...
I'll do the thinking, Scorpion. He's interrupted by Bugsy. Your figure isn't quite like Tarantula's, but the payroll people will get only one scared glimpse of you. Miss Moth indicates with her thumb, saying, I've parked the car yonder on the road.
As the payroll car arrives, the ambush works perfectly. Scorpion, disguised as Tarantula, pretends to take charge.
Yep, you can see the roadblock sign still there, and the disguised Scorpion, wearing Tarantula's costume, steps out in front saying,
Hands up, you mugs, or I'll blast you clear out of that car. The robbery is made swiftly.
Yeah, we see the staff of the payroll car all sort of standing with their hands up as Bugsy waves a gun in their direction. Scorpion, disguised as Tarantula, carrying the bags of money away, saying,
What a haul! We can retire on this.
And Bugsy is saying, Hey! Slow up with that swag. Don't run off with our share.
As they depart, the three robbers pretend to quarrel.
Bugsy, still with a mask over his face, says, Come on, divvy up. I get a third of the haul. The Cricket says,
Me too. I don't trust you.
And a grinning Scorpion says,
Quit making this fuss, or maybe I won't let you two saps have any of it. Hidden in the bushes, Budgie's gang completes the planting of false evidence.
Yeah, we see our Tarantula stretched out, Bugsy and Scorpion kneeling down, and Bugsy is planting a couple of bags of cash next to Tarantula's unconscious form, saying, We'll put the smallest bag beside him. When they find him, it'll look as if we fought and he was knocked silly. Scorpion's into this, he proclaims.
Great. The police arrive.
Yeah, police on a motorbike and sidecar arrive. The cop says,
What happened?
And the guard of the payroll car replies, We were robbed. A bird in a purple and yellow costume were charge of the gang. They shot out our tires and grabbed every nickel of the payroll.
The police make an immediate search and find...
Yep, the cops and the head payroll guard find Tarantula lying in the grass. The payroll guard points and says, Look, there he is. Tarantula, rubbing his head, sits up and says,
What happened? Who smacked me?
And then as he stands up in the next panel, the senior police officer and the head guard move towards him with the policeman saying,
Tarantula, or are you an imitation of him?
The payroll guard says at this point, Here's one of the payroll sacks. He and his pals are arguing over dividing the money. They must have carried off all but this.
In danger of being unmasked, Tarantula spies what has helped him so often. His lost web gun.
Yes, we see the web gun lying on the ground. In the final panel of page 6, we see Tarantula standing with the payroll guard and the 2 policemen. The senior policeman says,
All right, fella. Your pal slugged you and double-crossed you. Who were they?
and the younger cop says, get that mask off him. And the payroll guy seems to move in and start doing that. And Tarantula, spotting his weapon on the ground, thinks,
There's my web thrower. If I can get my hands on it.
the caption for the first panel on page 7 reads,
Stooping swiftly, Tarantula recovers his weapon.
Yep, he grabs it and quickly fires, whipping one of the policeman's guns out of his hands. The policeman exclaims,
Hey!
and Tarantula says,
I'm only doing this because I figure to round up the payroll gang myself.
caption for the next panel,
Breaking away, Tarantula heads for the woods.
Yep, Tarantula legs it, and it looks as though he's fired another line that the 2 policemen have tripped over as they try to follow him. We see the payroll guard is still standing there, and as he runs off, Tarantula is saying,
If I stop long enough to convince you of how the trick was really done, they may get away with all that money.
oh no, there is another big long caption.
Climbing out of sight with the help of vacuum discs on his feet and left glove, Tarantula rapidly turns over the evidence in his mind.
Yes, we can see the police on the ground beating through the foliage looking for Tarantula, but he's swinging through the trees and he's thinking,
That gang had a car that's out of sight. Somebody called the police to find. It must have been one of the gang. I think the car went along a hidden lane to a nearby hideout. Swinging lithely through the tree tops, Tarantula can see from above into the forest's secrets.
so Jonathan's swinging along and he sees and spots and says,
There's the hidden
and
driveway.
when he drops to the ground, we can see the marks of car tires in the grass as he thinks,
Here's where they left the car while they robbed the payroll party. And when they drove off, they headed that way. I'll follow the tracks.
and he does indeed, and we see a small shack in the middle of the woods with a red car parked outside it, and a silhouetted Tarantula takes all this in and says,
There they're hiding. Clever stunt. The police will comb the country far away. Meanwhile, certain that the framing of Tarantula has covered their trail, the robbers discuss the adventure.
Yep, we see them all inside. Scorpion Sykes still wearing his Tarantula costume. Bags of money on the table. The cricket is saying,
Remember that stuff about cheating each other was only part of the act. We want equal shares.
Bugsy slams a fist down on the table, saying, Now, I'm boss and my decision is final. On dividing profits as on everything else, I will divide it in this manner. Ah! But Bugsy's interrupted as a line suddenly comes flying through the window, pulling the money bags together, and a voice says,
I said that money stays all together.
and we see at the window the Tarantula who fires yet another web line that binds the cricket and Miss Moth's wrists together as he says,
There. That will serve the purpose until some real handcuffs arrive.
moving into the building, he then says,
Since you're the brains of the bunch, Bugsy, I'll hog-tie you, hand and foot.
and we see him spinning another line as Bugsy from behind looks alarmed and yells, But you're not supposed to be here. We left you for the police to find.
Ah, Bugsy, you admit it was a frame-up. I'll require you to repeat that when I call the police here. At this moment, Scorpion produces his pet weapon.
Yep, and we see Scorpion still dressed in purple and yellow. He whips out another little gun, which obviously looks very similar to the web gun, but it looks like a dart or something poison at the top, and he says,
You call nobody, Tarantula.
in the next panel, Tarantula squares up to him, saying,
That looks like a dart gun, Scorpion.
and Skinny Scorpion replies,
Yep, it's my stinger. The dart's poisoned. Even if you got a loop of web on me, I could still jab you somewhere and you'd die.
and the next panel's an insert shot of the stinger as Shudder, Scorpion fires, saying,
This will settle you. Then I take command. Divide the dough, give the orders. I'm going places. But lightning swift and sure, Tarantula spurts new whirls of web. Into their tangled depths the dart sinks and is caught.
Fantastic. See what you see captioning at its best there. Yes, indeed. We see Jonathan firing his web gun, which snares the dart and stops going any further. Tarantula says,
Your sting seems to be drawn, Scorpion. The only place you'll be going to is the state penitentiary.
a slow dissolve.
Scorpion is easily secured, and Tarantula makes his call to police headquarters.
Yep, we see Tarantula with her ancient-looking receiver and mouthpiece set, and he's saying,
Tarantula speaking, Chief. I've got the payroll robbers and recovered the money. I also have the man who impersonated me to throw you off the trail. Pay attention while I tell you how to get here.
and there's another slow dissolve. We're back at Jonathan Law's house with Olga and Jonathan, and Olga is saying, that whole gang of big-time criminals caught, the money returned, and everything. How can you think of such tricks, Mr. Law?
Oh, the criminals think of the tricks, Olga. All I do is make the tricks fail.
And our caption rounds this out saying,
String along with Tarantula's web trail as he finds new conflict and victory in the next issue of Star Spangled Comics.
Hooray!
For victory, buy United States Defense Bond stamps.
Yes, please do. Well, that was fun.
That was great fun. And also, another tarantula.
Well, yes, that's what I was going to say. You took the words right out of my mouth, as Meatloaf would say. Yeah, because about another one of your ones that you seem to specialise in unearthing where someone dresses up as the hero to do bad crimes.
Oh, I love it. I love it. It's great fun. Yes,
Gosh.
Another legacy tarantula, kind of, sort of.
Yes. Well, that was great fun.
Yeah.
Rattled along. I liked the bug-themed bad guys.
Uh-huh.
I must say, though, that Miss Moth doesn't go flying like she does in the splash image.
No, she doesn't.
What
No.
a complete con that was. I was expecting like her coat to sort of burst open and her to fly up and start zooming around and tripping
If only.
everyone up. That would have been tremendous.
If only.
Did Michael Fleischer and Jim O'Parrell travel back in time and come up with the idea for that splash panel? I think they may have done. Controversial. Yeah, what do we say about this one? I mean, the art was great. It rattled along, quite talky in places, but you know, at the same time, the plot was quite good. I liked the whole plan that they had to kind of impersonate Tarantula and steal the money and sour his name. That's another plot device that we've had a couple of times in the past as well, isn't it?
It's a shame that the bad guys didn't hugely have costumes. They're just still really in suits. Because, being Scorpion and Cricket, you can imagine it could have been a bit more exciting that way.
Yeah, I'm imagining it right now.
Yeah.
But I suppose it kind of goes what you've said in the past, though, that a lot of supervillains in the Golden Age didn't really go in for costumes.
Yeah,
they were just
guys in suits.
Yeah, gangsters and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it was good, though. Mm-hmm. Enjoyed it hugely.
That's what makes Tarantula a bit different, is the fact he did have some costume criminals,
Yeah.
Some of the rogues that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I mean, Miss Moth does have those moth-shaped buttons on her jacket,
okay.
and she has very stylised features. So I suppose that makes her slightly costumed. But I'm low-key enraged that we don't actually see her flying like we do in that splash image, because that's just terrific.
Yeah, it would have been.
That would have been amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, not to worry, indeed.
Great fun. And, the Tarantula is a proper hero here. I like how he's basically phoning the police at the end, just saying, listen carefully to my directions. You might get it wrong.
Well, yeah, because he did sort of track them through the forest as the cops are, I suppose, looking the other way.
He's very uber confident, whereas I think in All-Star Squadron he's played down as like being more of the onlooker who's got a bit of imposter syndrome about him.
Well, the thing I always remember about All-Star Squadron is that it always just seems like research for his book.
Yeah,
in a way. It's not really like he's got a huge, particularly strong motivation. It's not like a relative died or if he feels a real need to. It's kind of,
there's no Martha. No.
Yeah, this is interesting. I've often sort of, one of my, and again we'll talk about this further in a few years when we get to All-Star Squadron. One of the missed opportunities of All-Star Squadron was that there was quite a few heroes that didn't really have superpowers as such. And I always thought it would have been nice if Roy had done something, where like maybe the Guardian and Mr. Terrific and Tarantula and Crimson Avenger all sort of teamed up. The non-power guys had to team up because the superpower guys had been taken out. Something like that would have been, I suppose everyone has their ideas what they could have done if they were writing All-Star Squadron. But, there was some potential there that was maybe a little untapped. But I mean, we have to say that preempting it completely, our coverage, if we get that far. Tarantulas becomes a big part of All-Star Squadron.
Certainly does.
And,
yes.
And he's one of my favourite characters from it. To this day, I still wish DC Direct had done a few lines of All-Star Squadron action figures, and they've got Johnny and Libby and Tarantula and Amazing Man and Shining Knight and all that sort of stuff. It would have been terrific. Instead, they got to a point when they just gave us wave upon wave of Superman and Batman figures, and it all got very boring very quickly. Anyway.
Gasp.
I don't think we've got anything else to add to that, really. I think we agreed on the fact that the villains were cool. If it would have been nice to see them in costume, and that the plotting was very strong, and quite surprised at how dialogue heavy a lot of it was.
Yeah, true. Speaking of dialogue, I liked the explanation of how he's got a suction pad on one glove.
Yes,
because he's got that big. Because you actually see it in a couple of panels, this big suction pad on his glove. But obviously, the other one he's holding his web gun a lot of the time. So that's how he's managing to adhere to things. It's literally only with one hand.
Yeah, well, like one hand is adhering, the other hand is operating the web gun and stuff. That's all pretty cool.
Pretty cool. Yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah, Jinx, you my Fanta.
Yeah, like that. Although that cape's got to get in the way, I'll be honest. Seriously.
Yeah.
I'm glad of the costume change in All-Star Squadron, but hey, that's fine.
Yeah, we'll talk much more about All-Star Squadron far in the future.
Yes.
So, that would be Tarantulas number 2 and 3, technically.
Technically, yeah. Oh, excellent. On to the next one.
And our third Tarantula joins us from the pages of All American Comics number 88, published on the 20th of June 1947, 2 days after Paul McCartney's 5th birthday. Thank goodness for Paul McCartney, the cultural touchstone that he is. We're reading a story featuring our pal Dr. Midnight. And if you want to read along, listeners, this one was reprinted in DC Comics 100-page Super Spectacular number 20, which is one of the Batman ones. I think it's got the Batman and Two-Face stuff on the cover. So anyway, He's not on the cover, unfortunately, so Peter doesn't have to tell you about the cover. So
Yay.
we should jump straight in. An opening caption that reads, "From the casebook of Dr. Midnight." And we see a couple of lads. There's a very seedy-looking guy with a cap and a striped shirt with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, and another guy in a sort of pinstripe zoot suit and a big hat, and a big grumpy-looking bald guy with a very heavy brow line. And is that a sort of spider-type symbol on his chest?
Oh, it looks like it.
And they're standing in a darkened room using a projector to flash an image up on the wall, which is an image of two men. One on the left, man wearing dark glasses and a very smart green suit, and that's labelled Dr. McNider. On the other side, on the right-hand side, as we look at it, it's an image of, and labelled as such, of the superhero Dr. Midnight. And down the middle, it reads, height 6 feet, weight 180, chest 42 inches, waist 30 inches. 30 inches, well done, Chuck. And the guy in the pinstripe suit with the big hat and the big nose, he's pointing with this pointing stick, and he is saying, "Look, Tarantula, McNider writes the Dr. Midnight adventures. He writes them so real you'd think he was there when they happen. Both men of the same height, same measurements, I tell you. Dr. Midnight and McNider are one and the same." And then his bald, heavy-eyebrowed, spider on the chest compatriot replies,
No go, Logger. There are too many guys in this world with similar builds. Besides, McNider is blind. Your theories are okay, but where's your proof?
"So it's proof you want, Tarantula. I got it right in here." He opens a door at this point, saying, "Guess who's in this sack?" Pulling in a heavy bag, and the heavy-browed Tarantula exclaims,
Huh?
In the first panel of page 2, we open the bag, and Tarantula exclaims,
That's Dr. McNider, you idiot! Kidnapping a blind detective story writer? A nobody! Take him away, he's not worth a federal rap.
"But Dr. Midnight is," replies Logger. "And after I prove that he's really Dr. Midnight, we'll knock him off, and you'll be the biggest guy in the rackets. Here's how I found out." Leaves his cigarette, and we go into flashback territory. The next couple of panels are rippled. Logger's narration, "I'm passing Dr. McNider's house." And we see Logger looking in, and we see a silhouette, shadowy form of a man with some sort of cape and cowl going on. This prompts Logger to exclaim, "Dr. Midnight!" But then he takes a closer look in the next panel, and we see that it's Dr. McNider looking very buff in red and white striped boxers with a towel draped over his head and falling down his back. Logger changes his mind and thinks, "It's McNider. His shadow fooled me." We're back in the present day. Tarantula isn't having it. He yells,
Are you mad? 1 minute your McNider is Dr. Midnight, now you're saying McNider's McNider?
"I haven't finished, Tarantula. Here comes the payoff." And we see that Chuck McNider has kind of woken up, come to his senses, and he's obviously listening to what's happening, and he's thinking, uh-oh, I see what's coming. We go back to Logger's narration. "I couldn't forget the resemblance, so I hung around for another look at McNider when," and we see we're inside Dr. McNider's abode. He's pointing out his window. We can see Logger lurking outside. Significantly, there is a full moon in the sky behind him, so take a drink. And Dr. McNider has clocked Logger, and he says, "Hey, what are you doing out there?" To which Logger says, "Holy smoke, he spotted me." And the final panel of page 2 is Dr. McNider sits in silence in the foreground. We see Logger getting in Tarantula's face for emphasis and saying, "Get it? He spotted me. He isn't blind. He's Dr. Midnight. I only captured him because I was so nervous I forgot to fire and threw the gun at him. Luckily, it knocked him out." First panel of page 3, Dr. McNider pipes up saying, "Ridiculous. Why don't you have my eyes examined by a doctor? He'll tell you I can't see."
I've got a better idea, Dr. McNider. I'm going to leave you here with Logger guarding you.
Tarantula again. Look at those eyebrows. They're terrifying. They might be the biggest eyebrows I've ever seen. Next panel is a very helpful insert shot of Dr. McNider and Dr. Midnight, and it's captioned as such.
Editor's note. Though really blind, Dr. McNider uses special infrared glasses to see perfectly during the day, while at night his cat-like vision enables him to see in the dark.
Brilliant. We'll hope to get that little panel on the socials because it's brilliant. In the next panel, we see that Tarantula has crossed to his wall where it seems to have some kind of radio transmission set up. Dr. McNider, still tied to a chair, is watching him as Tarantula is saying,
And I'm going to pull the sort of crime that would attract Dr. Midnight. In fact, I'll announce it. If he shows up, you're safe. If he doesn't, then you are Midnight, and a goner.
The Tarantula's powerful set cuts into all broadcasts.
Dr. McNider, still bound to the chair, is thinking to himself at this point, "I'm in quite a mess this time. as the tarantula starts to speak into the microphone of his kit, saying,
Attention! This is a tarantula!
And then our next panel, we're in a local police station. A bunch of officers standing around the desk sergeant's radio crackles into life and we hear Tarantula's voice.
I'm going to free the Ramey gang in the Paul Street station, coppers, and take their loot from your safe. Ha ha ha!
The desk sergeant isn't having it. He says,
Bragging, Big Mouth. The tarantula hasn't a chance.
There's a rapid change of events here as we get a slow dissolve and a caption that says,
Soon after.
And everyone in the police station, presumably the Paul Street station, is asleep. We see the desk sergeant giving it big Zs. He's asleep at his desk, appropriately enough. He wouldn't be asleep at his toilet, would he, David, from crying out loud? Anyway, and all the other officers out for the count on the ground. Off camera, we hear a voice saying,
If they expect to catch the tarantula, they'll never do it while sleeping on the job.
And then in the final panel of page 3, we see Tarantula and the other goon who was hanging around with a big hat and looking louche and smoking a cigarette, the other goon, he leans in behind Tarantula and he's saying,
Swell idea, Tarantula. Putting gas bombs in the ventilating outlets.
To which Tarantula says,
It's safe to breathe by this time. Let's get to work.
The first panel of page 4, we see that they've gone in, further into the building, Tarantula and this guy and another goon in a purple suit, and Tarantula is attempting to open the safe, as he mentioned. Tarantula is down, twirling the wheel to get the combination, and he's saying,
After we get the loot, we'll free the Ramey gang.
This prompts the chap in blue with the big cap to say,
Dr. Midnight ain't showed up. Logger was right after all. McNider is Midnight.
Suddenly, Dr. Midnight bursts through the door, saying, Is he? To which Tarantula says,
Dr. Midnight, shoot men!
The next panel, Dr. Midnight leaps for the overhead light fitting, swinging on it, saying, What's your score on a moving target? As the baddies all fire at him, and Tarantula says,
You'll know soon enough.
Why not make it sooner? Says the doctor, as he swings and collides with Tarantula, landing on his chest, making him fall backwards.
Ugh!
Exclaims Tarantula. The purple suit goon leaps forward at this point, grabbing Doc from behind, saying, We don't mind, Russian. And the big, overweight, blue-suited goon with a cap says,
Yeah, as long as you're the
He
target.
slaps Dr. Midnight in the face with his pistol. Good grief. The doctor says in the next panel, Let's change targets. And he flips Purple Suit Goon over his shoulder so he collides with the overweight guy in the blue suit. Good gosh, hope you're keeping up. And then the first panel, page 5, the doctor gives Purple Suit Goon another punch, sending him falling back. We see the desk sergeant starting to come to in the background, and Tarantula notices this, saying,
Uh-oh, the law's beginning to wake up.
As the desk sergeant says,
What goes on?
Dr. Midnight replies, I've got a tarantula and his unmerry men. Uh-oh, Mr. Big Noise got away.
Not long after.
We see Tarantula bombing up a very fancy set of stairs. We may have gone around saying,
Was I lucky getting away? Whew. But I still don't know if Logger was right or wrong. If McNider's gone, then that means he's Midnight.
Tarantula, in the next panel, comes through the doorway back into his office, as it were, to see Logger still sat there in his big pinstripe suit, and what looks like Dr. McNider still sat tied up in the chair. Tarantula says,
McNider's still here, eh? That means you're wrong, Logger. Dr. Midnight tackled us at the station and wrecked us. He couldn't be in two places at once.
To which Logger says, Yeah, what now?
Knock McNider off. He knows too much. Midnight's on my trail. I'll hide out in the Rex Roadhouse.
And with that, Tarantula takes his leave, Logger saying, Okay, see you later. And with a thump, you see his legs uncrossing and his foot coming to the ground. There appears to be some... Is that a line coming from his foot? Caption for the next panel.
Suddenly,
Dr. McNider gets to his feet. The ropes that were securing him fall away. He wasn't tied up at all. The doctor says, if the tarantula looked closer, he would have seen that I wasn't really tied. And that I was talking for Logger and pulling this string that made it look as if he was moving. And we see that there indeed was a line attached to Logger's left foot and that Dr. McNider had been manipulating it. Good grief, a slow dissolve.
sometime later at the Rex Roadhouse.
Yes, the Rex Roadhouse. This looks like a fun place. We can see the sign outside that says Dancing, Gambling, Fred Bread's Band, Roulette. There appears to be a slight full moon lingering in the distance, so you can take a drink if you like. You can take a slight drink.
Take a drink at Rex's Roadhouse.
Yep, we get a great look at the tarantula's gear here. It looks like flared sailor's white trousers that he's wearing under this green top with a spider emblem on it. And Tarantula's making his way into Rex Roadhouse and saying,
I'll be safe here. Everybody has forgotten about this deserted old joint. Now for some light.
and with that, he clicks on a light switch inside Rex's Roadhouse, and he is greeted, as the lights come up, with a familiar figure. Dr. Midnight is stood there, and he says, "Personally, I prefer to work in the dark."
No, it can't be.
And he lunges forward, punching the doc with a whack, saying,
You're not going to mess up my plans forever.
"Ugh," says the doc as he falls back. And in the next panel, Tarantula kicks Dr. Midnight in the chest. The doc exclaims, "Ugh!" And then there's a couple of
Bang bangs.
as the Tarantula fires his pistol, which seems to hit Doc either in the chest or the arm. As he's doing all this, Tarantula says,
You're not so tough.
Final panel, page 6, the Doctor's down on the ground, leaning against the counter. We can see all the chips and stuff piled up for the gambling, and the shadow of the Tarantula looming over him. As Tarantula says,
I'm going to enjoy this, Midnight.
the pistol pointed at the Doctor. But then, thankfully, in the first panel, page 7, Doc gets to his feet, saying, I'm still in the game, Tarantula, and he grabs a handful of poker chips and hurls them into Tarantula's face. Tarantula exclaims,
Ah, poker chips. Where are you?
Doc gets to his feet properly in the next panel, saying, and here's my winning hand. Game's over. And unleashes a massive punch. The crack. Tarantula goes flying into the corner, dropping his gun. A slow dissolve.
A half hour later.
We're back at Tarantula's headquarters. Dr. McNider still sat in the chair. Logger in front of him, and Dr. McNider is saying, Wake up, Logger, wake up.
Gee, Doc, you certainly made the times pass fast with your stories, but why am I so sleepy? Ugh.
Suddenly,
Door flies open, and about half a dozen police pile in, with the lead one saying,
Are you alright, Dr. McNider? A few minutes ago we got a personal call from Dr. Midnight telling of your kidnapping.
Logger, wide-eyed, points at Chuck and says,
Then you can't be Dr. Midnight, because I've been watching you all evening.
They cut to close-up of Dr. McNider as he thinks to himself, Logger never knew I hypnotised him and I was able to come and go as I pleased. Phew. My secret identity as Dr. Midnight is still safe. Things round out with a caption that reads,
More crime-fighting adventures with Dr. Midnight in every issue of All American Comics.
Terrible ending.
I loved it. Superb.
Logger never knew I hypnotised. I mean, did they even hint at anything earlier on that Chuck was going to do such a thing? Not really, because Logger just is in that first panel at the top of page 3, and then you don't see him till Tarantula comes back and he's all doped up.
Yeah.
Right, okay. I didn't know that Dr. Midnight was a master hypnotist. Did you, listeners?
Or ventriloquist, for that matter. That was fascinating.
He's the Silver Age Superman of his time.
Yes. It's superb.
Good grief.
Now, the Superman comparison is very apt. It's very Silver Bronze Age Superman to sort of like do the whole super ventriloquism thing. Imagine Clark tied up.
Yes.
Something like that. You can imagine literally it being swapped out.
Yes, it's the sort of thing that makes you think, makes you glad that the Kryptonite No More and that whole storyline actually happened, even though it didn't last very long. Yeah, John Byrne had a reason. Anyway, no, that was interesting. I mean, I liked the stuff with Logger sort of scoping out and happening to pass and seeing that Chuck with a towel wrapped round his head cast a very similar silhouette to Dr. Midnight. Logger must have some previous with Dr. Midnight, I think.
Looks like it, yeah.
Tarantula wasn't very tarantula-y, was he?
No, apart from his big spider chest. I suppose tarantulas are quite hairy and he's got big hairy eyebrows.
Bald as a coot, though.
Yeah, well, it's just to make the eyebrows stand out more.
Maybe it's just a nickname or something. Maybe he's got a
Could
tattoo
be.
or something. Maybe it's like... I don't know. Yes, out of all of the tarantulas that we've done this week, none of them have been, apart from Jonathan Law himself, none of them have been particularly spidery.
Very true. It's just a cool name.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, that was a very fun story. It must be said.
It was, yes.
It rattled along, and even though I was slightly wrong-footed by that final. And this is why it happened, readers, because I was doing all this. Oh, right, okay. Might have given a... But I suppose we could have wondered, why Logger was unresponsive, and I suppose the intrigue is sort of seeded as to what might have been going on.
I want to know where they got these photographs of Dr. McNider and Dr. Midnight for that first projected image.
Yeah.
Also, how do they know their exact measurements?
Yep, it's like you read my mind. Did they sneak up behind both of them with an inch tape?
And in the picture as well, Dr. Midnight looks shorter than Dr. McNider.
That's just a perspective, I think.
I know, but it's just the fact that they're saying they're both identical, but one of them definitely looks shorter than the
think
other.
it's just the way, because it's at a slight angle away from us. And
Oh, I know.
but the thing is, they're standing in identical stances, but which is quite interesting. But even the lines of their mouth don't look very similar.
Yes.
Do we know who drew this?
Yes, this is actually by Alex Toth.
Oh, marvellous. It feels like we haven't had much of Alex for a while.
That's probably why there's so much detail in the faces and the caricatures. And see, actually, when you look at the figure of Dr. Midnight walking with the the cowl, like the towel
Sure.
cowl, as it
Sure.
were. That actually looks a bit Space Ghosty, do you not think? Which, of course, is an Alex Toth creation. So
I
yes,
suppose, yeah, no, I can
Yeah.
see what you mean.
That look,
yeah,
I think it's quite cool.
that's fair.
Mhm.
That's reasonable.
But yes, that's why the caricatures of the bad guys and everything look so good, and why the action is dynamic as it is.
It's not quite as inconsequential as the Sandman one, but it's quite clever because it shows that Dr. Midnight was obviously quite cunning, quite a good thinker,
Yeah,
quite a good planner. I mean, we haven't done too many stories with him
No, very true.
on the
Very
podcast,
true.
to be honest. Like, he's turned up in a couple of JLA stories, and
Yeah.
that's been about it. So it's nice to kind of spend a little bit more time with him. Again, we keep talking about All-Star Squadron. He turns up in All-Star Squadron quite a lot when it starts. So
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to see what we think of when we get there.
The look of Logger kind of reminded me a bit of Lou Costello,
Sure.
actually. Kind of, like heavier set, and just
Yeah.
his features. It's just,
Yeah, and it's a good point you make about how all of the bad guys all look sort of really quite different and have
Yeah.
strongly differentiated sort of characteristics and stuff.
The bodies as well, when like people are getting thrown
Yeah.
about and punched, it's very fluid. It's not stiff at all. It's very interesting.
Mhm.
It's very cool. And when Midnight jumps up and basically does the whole chandelier swing and lands in Tarantula, that just looks epic. That's
It does.
fantastic.
Yeah, very, very emphatic, I think is probably a good word for it.
Mhm.
It's always interesting when you think that a bad guy might have found out a hero's secret identity.
Yeah.
And, it's quite an interesting way that Dr. Midnight dealt with things or managed to sort of stop it. He didn't seem too panicked about it too much. I mean, and it's also quite good, I suppose, that Tarantula was sceptical about it.
Yeah.
And the Doc was able to play into that and sort of, Tarantula remained unconvinced, I think.
Indeed. It's another thing that we've had fairly recently is a bad guy with a big ham radio set up.
Yes.
We seem to have come across that a few times recently.
Yeah, that was pretty, like the guy in that World's Finest story we did
Yeah,
a few weeks ago in our most recent Portmanteau episode, listeners.
Yes.
That's probably it for the Dr. Midnight one, I think, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. Now, we can't really go without giving a bit more detail on the Atlas Comics Tarantula, who we mentioned very briefly when we did our Atlas episode a few weeks ago. The Atlas Tarantula appeared in all 3 issues of weird suspense, and he's quite one of the better ones, I think, actually. He's a character called Count Eugene Lycosa, and he's almost like a were tarantula. An ancestor of his was cursed by a witch, basically, and the Count can transform into this sort of like human spider. I mean, suitably grotesque. If there's time or room, I'll maybe put the covers of this tarantula up on the socials so you can have a look at it, listeners. He's sort of been cursed for years, and like some of the other Atlas characters, likes to eat some of the people that he's fighting. It's interesting because he has been cursed by this witch who was burnt at the stake, and the Count has sort of chosen to sort of like, use his powers for good, as it were, rather than just being a baddie. It's definitely one of the better ones, just purely because some of the art is gorgeous and it's really quite grotesque. Written by Michael Fleischer, I'm sure, as well, which is, maybe why some of the grotesque stuff is so enjoyable, because he'd been practicing on the Spectre.
He certainly had been, yes. And of course, we can't go without mentioning the Marvel Tarantula. There actually have been several Marvel Tarantulas, but the most famous one is Luis Alvarez, who was probably best known for appearing in the front cover of Spectacular Spider-Man issue 1.
Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man.
Indeed,
Yeah.
yes.
He pops up a few times on the cover, all doing very similar poses, doesn't he?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
At one point, it does get turned into a giant spider as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty cool.
IIRC, yes.
Right.
Hmm.
Interesting.
But yes, there have been other versions of the tarantula, including his daughter, and in Marvel. So yes, there are thousands of tarantulas all out there. Gasp.
Loads of them.
I hope you're not an arachnophobe.
No.
Listener. No.
As I said at the top, this is all a bit of a preamble, bit of fun before next week's Superman Family story. If you want to read along, get hold of a copy of Superman Family issue 169, as Lois Lane and Superman encounter another tarantula.
You most certainly do.
That's still to come next week. So, listeners, what are your thoughts on the stories we've covered today? Peter, if listeners had thoughts or opinions on comic book tarantulas, where could they send them?
Well, you can email us at theearth2podcast@gmail.com. Make sure you follow us on social media, because we're putting up some lovely 8-legged content for you. On Facebook and Instagram, we're at the Earth2 Podcast, and on Twitter, we're at podcast_Earth2.
Yep, so I will say at this point, if you could summon the energy to go to wherever it is you receive your podcasts and leave us a positive review, that would be dandy. If you want to go to our coffee page, you'll find a link in our link tree. You can buy Peter the price of a beverage as he stitches these 3 stories together, all recorded variously this afternoon. We had our first podcast road trip today, listeners.
We did indeed, yes.
But you might have already seen the results of that on the socials by now.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Stay tuned if you haven't done already. Anyway, on that bombshell,
I've been Peter.
I've been David. We'll see you again soon on
The Earth 2 Podcast.
Transmatter cube activated. Return coordinates set for Earth Prime.
Here's how I found out. Let me try that again. Here's how I found. Here's how I found out.